Today, we step into Sacramento, winter of 1978, a city of cul-de-sacs, trimmed lawns, and neighbors who believed their doors and routines could keep the darkness out. But behind one apartment's drawn curtains, that illusion was rotting. A gaunt young man wandered the streets in a blood-stained parka, muttering to himself, reeking of decay. People crossed the road to avoid him, never realizing they were brushing past a storm already breaking. When the police finally forced their way inside his apartment, they didn't find clutter or mess. They found something far worse. A refrigerator stocked not with groceries, but with horrors. A blender caked in dried red residue. Walls marked with stains no scrubbing could erase. It was not the home of a criminal hiding spoils. It was a workshop of a man who believed his body was collapsing from within, and that only by drinking life from others could he endure another day. Sacramento had seen killers before, but nothing like this. History would brand him a name straight from folklore, a title that would stain the city forever: the Vampire Killer. There's a photograph, black and white, tucked inside the Sacramento Police Archive. It's unremarkable at first glance. Just the beige interior of a modest 1970s home, the kind where neighbors wave good morning and sprinklers hum at dawn. But the longer you stare, the harder it is to breathe. On the linoleum floor, there's a coffee mug tipped over. Its liquid dried into a sticky brown pool. Near it, a small set of footprints, tiny, belonging to a child, trails off into a blur. And then the camera's focus finds what the officers first saw, something that should never exist in a suburban living room. Richard Trenton Chase was not a man who killed because he wanted money or vengeance, or even because voices told him to. He was a man consumed by a nightmare of his own making, one where he believed his blood was turning to dust, his heart shrinking to nothing. He needed more. And he took it in ways that still make seasoned detectives leave the room to vomit decades later. What makes this story unbearable is not only the horror of his crimes, it's a methodical unraveling of a life that might, under different circumstances, have simply slipped into obscurity. Instead, Sacramento found itself haunted by a predator unlike any other. Not a thief, not a stalker, not even a garden variety madman. Something raw, something primitive, a man who looked into the abyss of his own delusion and decided to drag others in with him. When neighbors reported the smell, they thought maybe an animal had died under the porch. They weren't wrong. Something had died, but it wasn't an animal. It was a boundary between civilization and something much older, something vampiric. And once that line was crossed, no one in Sacramento would ever sleep the same way again. Sacramento in the late 1970s was not supposed to be the setting for Gothic horror. This was California's capital city, a place of state workers, neatly mowed lawns, and neighborhoods that radiated a quiet middle-class confidence. The economy was stable, the crime rate lower than in sprawling Los Angeles or gritty San Francisco. Families rode bikes down shaded avenues. Kids slurped popsicles under sprinkler arcs. It was a place designed for predictability. But if you peer under the fluorescent glow of strip malls and the hum of highway traffic, there was something festering in the background. The 1970s had been a decade marinated in paranoia. Charles Manson had carved his mythology into California skin less than a decade earlier. The Zodiac Killer's cryptic taunt still lingered unsolved, like stains no one could scrub out. And Sacramento itself had seen its share of unease. Burglary sprees, a strangling or two, whispers of cults in rural counties. It was a time when neighbors locked their doors but still assumed evil was elsewhere, down south in the city, out on the fringes. Not here, not among us. The mental health system wasn't helping. Institutions had been gutted, doors flung open in the name of reform. Patients who once might have been monitored or medicated were now adrift, wandering sidewalks with plastic bags full of belongings. mumbling to themselves as society looked the other way. If you were broken, you were often invisible. Against this backdrop, Sacramento's suburban tranquility was fragile, like wallpaper stretched over rotting wood. And it was into this exact setting that Richard Trenton Chase moved like a contagion. The streets he haunted weren't dark alleys or red light districts. They were cul-de-sacs lined with swing sets and pastel shutters. Places where mothers set out milk cartons in the morning, not realizing their neighborhood was about to become the backdrop for one of the most grotesque crime sprees America had ever seen. The horror didn't arrive with a scream. It seeped in like a gas leak, silent, odorless at first, until suddenly everyone was choking. Richard Trenton Chase. Even his name feels brittle, like it's about to crack between your teeth. He wasn't born a monster, though people love to flatten stories into neat lines. Evil from the start. No, he was born in 1950 in sunny Santa Clara into a household that, from the outside, looked like any other mid-century American dream. 2 parents, a neat lawn, photographs of birthdays where everyone forces a smile. But underneath, the wallpaper was already peeling. His father was strict, violence often standing in for discipline. His mother was fragile, frayed at the edges, consumed by her own fears. It was not a house where tenderness lived, but one where silence was broken by shouting, doors slamming, and the low thrum of paranoia that seemed to seep from the adults into the child. As a boy, Chase displayed what psychologists later described with sterile detachment, the McDonald triad: setting fires, hurting animals, wetting the bed well past the age of reason. But saying it like that is too clean, too academic. What it really means is this: neighbors' pets went missing, matches struck in places they shouldn't, and a child began carving out a reputation as someone you didn't want babysitting your dog. High school brought no salvation. He was lanky, awkward, the kind of teenager who disappeared into corners at parties. Friends? Few. Girlfriends? None. He was incapable of sustaining intimacy, of holding on to anyone. Doctors later noted he suffered from erectile dysfunction, a condition that shredded his self-esteem and fueled his conviction that something inside his body was fundamentally broken. And that conviction metastasized. He believed his heart would stop beating unless he replenished it. He thought his blood was evaporating, leaking out invisibly, leaving him hollow. These weren't passing delusions. They were his gospel. By his early 20s, Chase was dabbling in drugs, drifting between half-hearted attempts at independence, and spiraling into psychosis. He was institutionalized briefly, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and even deemed a danger. At one point, staff found him smeared in blood. He told them it was from birds. He'd caught them, crushed them, and tried to absorb their vitality. Doctor prescribed medication, but medication only works if you take it. And Chase didn't. What walked out of those institutions wasn't a man cured. It was a man convinced he had discovered his survival mechanism. The logic of his sickness had hardened into truth. To live, he needed blood. To be whole, he had to feed. And in Sacramento, no one would prepare for what that belief would mean. It began small, almost laughably small, if you didn't know what it foreshadowed. Dead animals started turning up in the neighborhood. Cats, dogs, even rabbits. At first, it was blamed on coyotes or some careless drivers. But if you looked closely, the remains told another story. They weren't mauled, they were opened, organs missing, fluids gone. Whoever, or whatever, had done it wasn't just killing. They were harvesting. Richard Chase was in his mid-20s then, a gaunt figure haunting Sacramento streets, with his stringy hair and hollow cheeks. He had already convinced himself that his body was deteriorating, that he had no choice but to seek out life in others. Neighbors sometimes saw him crouching in yards, staring at nothing, muttering under his breath. People avoided him, but avoidance isn't protection. The first clear human disturbance came in December 1977. Ambrose Griffin, a 51-year-old engineer, was unloading groceries with his wife when he collapsed on the driveway. At first, she thought it was a heart attack. Then she saw the blood. He had been shot. Seemingly out of nowhere, a drive-by that didn't fit any local pattern. Police scoured the area and came up with little. Just a senseless, motiveless killing. Sacramento shrugged uneasily and moved on. But Chase wasn't moving on. He was escalating. He began breaking into homes, not to steal jewelry or televisions, but to test doors. If they were locked, he interpreted that as a sign he wasn't welcome. If they were open, then fate had granted him permission. Inside, he rifled through kitchens, drank sodas, smeared blood from stolen animals across walls. He left a trail of confusion. Homeowners returned to find their beds disturbed, their pets missing, their carpet stained with inexplicable messes. It was as if Chase was rehearsing, building up courage for the inevitable leap from animals to humans. And when that leap came, it wasn't tentative. It was feral, absolute, and irreversible. The killing of Ambrose Griffin was Sacramento's warning shot. Few recognized it as such at the time, but in hindsight, it was the first crack in the dam. And once Richard Chase pressed forward, nothing, no locked door, no neighborhood watch, no frantic phone call, would stop the flood from breaking loose. Here's the part that still makes my skin crawl. Sacramento didn't understand what it was dealing with. Not at first. They had a phantom on their hands. A man who didn't kill like anyone else didn't rob. Didn't even bother to cover his tracks. The usual motives, lust, greed, rage, none of them fit. Instead, his crimes looked like the scribblings of a fever dream. In January 1978, the dam burst. 22-year-old Teresa Wallen was at home, 3 months pregnant, when Chase chose her unlocked door as an invitation. What happened inside is something that can't be fully captured in police reports, no matter how meticulously typed. Officers wrote about mutilation, about organs removed, about a scene so grotesque it broke seasoned investigators. But what really happened was that Chase treated her body as if it were a butcher's counter, and worse, as if it were a pharmacy, a source of the medicine he believed he needed to keep himself alive. The crime scene photographs, sealed now, hidden from public view, show not a random act of violence, but a ritual of madness. Bullet casings on the floor, smears of blood where he drank, discarded wrappers from things he'd stolen from her fridge, like a child raiding the kitchen after destroying the house. And this is where Sacramento realized something was stalking them that had no use for reason. Mothers began double-locking their doors in the middle of the day. Men started carrying guns on afternoon errands. Newspapers whispered about a madman, but whispers weren't enough to prepare anyone for what came next, because Chase wasn't satisfied. A single act of horror didn't calm the delusion. It stoked it. Within days, he struck again, this time annihilating an entire household. Evelyn Miroff, her young son, her nephew, even a visiting friend. None spared. He turned the home into a slaughterhouse, his delusions dictating every action, his thirst blinding him to humanity. The mystery deepened not because police couldn't see what had happened. They saw all too well, but because no one could comprehend why. How do you profile someone whose motive isn't pleasure or profit, but the paranoid belief that his very organs will stop working unless he consumes others? It wasn't a crime spree in the traditional sense. It was a man methodically disassembling reality, dragging his city into his hallucination. And the worst part? He wasn't hiding. He wasn't shadow in the night. He was a thin man in a parka, spotted by neighbors with stains on his clothes, walking openly through the streets as if nothing was wrong. The city was staring its nightmare in the face, and still didn't realize it. The Sacramento police By late January 1978, were drowning. This wasn't a case. They could understand a case. This was chaos made flesh. The slaughter at the Miroff household wasn't just another crime scene. It was an abattoir that defied explanation. Detectives walked out to vomit in the snow-damp yards. Reporters couldn't even print the details, not without sounding like they'd slipped into pulp horror fiction. And so the theories began to swirl, grotesque and desperate. Was it ritualistic? Cult activity? The word satanic was muttered under breaths, because it was easier to believe a coven had done this than to accept that a lone, sickly man was capable of such carnage. Some investigators even floated the idea of two perpetrators. Surely one person could inflict so much destruction so quickly. But then came the patterns, faint but undeniable. Entry through unlocked doors. A methodical fixation on the body itself, not valuables. Evidence that the killer lingered, almost casually, after the violence was over, eating, drinking, leaving signs of grotesque comfort. This wasn't a thief, wasn't a gang initiation. This was someone who believed the homes were supermarkets for his survival. Neighbors began reporting a strange figure, a gaunt man wandering alleys, buying armloads of animal organ from butcher shops, sometimes demanding rabbit blood at gunpoint. He'd been seen smeared in red, muttering about needing the substance. These weren't just coincidences. They were neon arrows pointing to Richard Chase. Police canvassed, gathered leads, pulled fingerprints from crime scenes. The name Chase kept surfacing, whispered by locals who described him as unstable, terrifying, someone who smelled a decay. But building a case wasn't as simple as arresting a lunatic. They needed proof that the madness in their files matched the madness in their streets. Meanwhile, the FBI's behavioral science unit was called in. Robert Ressler, the man who would later coin the term serial killer, sat down with detectives to sketch out the psychology of their phantom. Ressler's profile was chillingly precise. An unkempt, disorganized killer, a man in his 20s, thin, socially isolated, who believed his survival depended on consumption of blood. This wasn't theory. It was Richard Chase, practically drawn in silhouette. Still, the city flailed in fear. Parents wouldn't let their kids walk to school. Hardware stores sold out of locks and deadbolts. People began sleeping with baseball bats beside their beds. Theories filled the air like static, but only one was true. Sacramento was being hunted by a man who thought he'd become a vampire. The turning point didn't arrive with a thunderclap. It came with the quiet persistence of neighbors who were simply too terrified to ignore the strange man next door anymore. Richard Chase, by this time, was unraveling in plain sight. He wandered the streets with blood on his clothes, reeking of rot. He knocked on doors at random, asking for old newspapers, asking for water, asking questions that made people slam their locks shut. The last murders, the Miroff household, were so public, so frenzied, that Sacramento was no longer whispering. The city was vibrating with fear. And then one woman, Nancy Holden, came forward. She told police about running into a former high school acquaintance at the town and country shopping center, a gaunt, sunken-eyed man who smelled foul, who wore an orange parka smeared with stains. He had cornered her, begged for a ride. She fled, unnerved, but she remembered his name, Richard Chase. Police put the pieces together with sudden, brutal clarity. Chase's purchase of animal organs, his bizarre reputation, his match to the FBI profile, every road ended at his doorstep. So they staked out his apartment. And what they found wasn't the lair of a criminal mastermind. It was a collapse of a human being, condensed into one suffocating space. His curtains drawn tight, empty cartons and soda cans stacked like miniature barricades. On the walls, smears, stains, symbols only he understood. Inside the fridge, God help the officers who open it. Human remains, stored like leftovers. A blender crusted with blood. When police knocked, Chase didn't come quietly. He ran, bolting from the door like a cornered animal, but he wasn't fast enough. They tackled him on the street, the neighbors watching through blinds. The nightmare finally dragged into daylight. That arrest was a breakdown of two worlds colliding, the ordinary and the unthinkable. Sacramento's polite suburbia against the raw madness of a man who believed his veins were drying up, and when they pried him away from the pavement, they weren't just hauling off a killer. They were peeling away the thin facade that had allowed this terror to walk openly among them. It was over, technically. The killing spree had ended. But the real horror was only just beginning. The trial, the testimony, the realization of just how much of Richard Chase's sickness had been ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood until it was too late. The courtroom became its own kind of theater, and Richard Chase was the star nobody wanted. He shuffled in, skeletal, with a hollow stare of a man who looked less alive than the corpses he'd left behind. Jurors tried not to meet his gaze. Families of the victims sat rigid, clutching tissues, staring daggers through the man who had turned their loved ones into props for his delusion. The defense leaned into insanity, painting Chase as a man so far gone that he couldn't tell right from wrong. They described his schizophrenia, his paranoia, the blood rituals he confessed to as survival. They wanted the jury to see not a predator, but a patient, a man failed by a system that had tossed him out with a prescription bottle and a handshake. The prosecution countered with brutal precision. They displayed photographs that silenced the room. They called witnesses who described his escalating violence, his obsession with animal organs, his belief that locked doors were a sign he was unwelcome, but unlocked doors were permission. They argued that insanity didn't excuse what he had done, because his actions weren't random. They were methodical, chosen, repeated, and there were questions the trial could never quite answer. How much of Chase's horror was his own, and how much was a failure of institutions that had diagnosed him, institutionalized him, and then released him back in the world knowing he was dangerous? Was he a man who needed punishment, or a man who had needed saving long before Sacramento bled for his delusions? In the end, the jury didn't hesitate. They convicted him of 6 counts of murder. The verdict carried weight, like a stone dropped into water, death in the gas chamber. The courtroom exhaled, but it wasn't relief. Relief doesn't exist in cases like this. Only the faint hope that the worst has been contained. And yet the lingering questions never faded. Could this have been stopped if someone had intervened sooner? If doctors had kept him institutionalized? If neighbors had reported the dead animals earlier? Richard Chase was behind bars, but the story didn't feel resolved. It felt like a wound, poorly stitched, still leaking beneath the bandage. After the trial, Sacramento tried to snap back to its suburban rhythm. Lawns mowed, sprinklers humming, the smell of barbecue drifting over fences. But you don't unsee something like Richard Chase. The city carried his ghost the way you carry a scar, hidden beneath clothes, but tender when touched. Parents who lived through those months kept their children close, doors bolted even in broad daylight, as if the phantom might come strolling back down Marconi Avenue at any moment. The families of the victims never fully healed. How could they? Their loved ones have been reduced to footnotes in a nightmare, their names overshadowed by the grotesque infamy of the man who destroyed them. Court transcripts became relics. Police reports a kind of scripture, but none of it could answer the only question that mattered. Why them? The case forced uncomfortable conversations. California's mental health system, already gutted, came under sharper scrutiny. How had a man this disturbed been deemed fit for release? How had doctors written notes about his violent delusions, his blood-drinking rituals with birds, and then simply let him walk? Politicians wrung their hands, promised reforms, then quietly shuffled on once the headlines dimmed. But among law enforcement, the Chase case lingered like a curse. The FBI's behavioral science unit used him as a case study. A disorganized killer, A man whose psychosis drove him to crime scenes that looked like war zones. His name became shorthand in criminology classes. The example professors whispered when they wanted to remind students just how thin the line between theory and horror really was. Even pop culture couldn't resist. Horror movies borrowed from him, though they rarely admitted it outright. The pale, shambling vampire who doesn't sparkle but reeks of disease. Richard Chase is in that DNA. His crimes still ripple through the genre, a reminder that the most terrifying monsters don't sprout fangs. They just stop taking their medication. And Sacramento? It never truly shed the stain. Ask someone old enough to remember, and they'll lower their voice when they speak his name, as though saying it too loudly might wake him up again. There's an image that refuses to leave me. Richard Chase, locked in a cell at San Quentin, thin as a scarecrow, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He wasn't gassed in the chamber as the jury ordered. No, he chose his own ending, swallowing a horde of antidepressants he'd hoarded, slipping away quietly in 1980. The so-called vampire of Sacramento didn't meet his end in a blaze of justice, but in a lonely act of self-erasure, as though even he couldn't live with what he had become. And that's the cruelty of this story. There's no catharsis, no neat bow. Chase wasn't a supernatural figure, no immortal night creature from folklore. He was a man, a broken, untreated, spiraling man. And that's so much worse, isn't it? Because you can stake a vampire, close the coffin, salt the earth. But what do you do with the knowledge that, under the right neglect, under the right cracks in the system, under the right cocktail of biology and circumstance, someone like him could be born again? Some killers force us to ask, are they evil or are they sick? With Chase, the line blurs until it dissolves completely. He was both. He was neither. He was a reflection of everything we fear about the human mind when it breaks beyond repair. There's a phrase that detectives mutter about him, even today. He was the kind of monster you don't catch. You just hope you never meet. It wasn't about his cunning or strength. It was about the abyss he carried inside himself, an abyss that swallowed 6 lives and left a city forever haunted. And maybe that's the real horror. Not that Richard Chase believed he needed blood to live, but that in his own twisted way, he was right. He did need it, because without it, he was nothing but a husk, and husks don't scare us. What scares us is a husk that still manages to walk, to knock on your door, to smile faintly as it asks for a ride. That smile is what Sacramento remembers. That smell, that parka, that reminder that monsters don't need fangs. They just need the space to grow unchecked. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next case.